Welcome to another Sunday school lesson. This one is session 8 from the quarterly, or if you follow in the Bible, you need to go to 2 Kings chapter 5. The last lesson we had stopped in 1 Kings chapter 19, so a lot has happened in the pages between the two lessons. But in a nutshell, the nations of Aram or Syria is the same nation. It's called different names at different times, and it depends on which version of the scriptures you read. But this nation and Israel were involved in multiple conflicts. Aram invaded Israel during Baasha and Ahab's reigns as king, and during one of those reigns, they would bring out captives, but one time they brought out a young servant girl who would be important in today's lesson. An account was included in these pages where Ahab wanted to have a vineyard near his palace that belonged to Naboth. Naboth refused to sell the family vineyard, and Ahab went into the palace and sulked like a spoiled child. After finding out the problem, Jezebel took matters into her hands, got some false accusations about Naboth, which resulted in him being stoned to death. And at that point, she just told Ahab, well, then go get Naboth's vineyard. So you can see Jezebel is still just as evil as she ever wanted to be. Aram, Israel, and Judah went through changes in kings. Elisha, who had been appointed by Elijah to be his successor, stayed by Elijah's side until his departure from earth. He had one request, and that was to have a double portion of Elijah's spirit, which God granted. So he is the primary on this scene for today's lesson. With God's power, there were several accounts of miracles and actions recorded in the chapters preceding the lesson for today. He cleared water, brought a curse upon some jeering, unkind boys, prophesied about Israel and Judah's conflict with Moab, helped a widow's olive oil to be miraculously multiplied so she could pay her debts, prophesied to a prominent woman of Shunem, that she would have a son within a year. She did. He died at an early age, and God, through Elisha, raised him from the dead. So Elisha was truly a much needed prophet of God for his time. Now, if you have time to read those missing chapters, you'll find multiple examples of how God is in control and how he uses people for his purposes. But in our lesson for today, we're introduced to a man named Naaman. So this comes from 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Aram or Syria, was a great man with his master. And his master was the king, believed to be Ben-Hadad II. And he was honorable because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. Naaman was a man who, according to society, had everything going for him. He was the commander of the royal army of Aram. He was considered a valiant warrior. He had gained the respect of the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad II. And of course, Aram was still a pagan nation, but the Lord had used Naaman to give Aram a military victory. So his life seemed to be wonderful, except he had a dreaded skin disease, leprosy. He was still out and about in public, so evidently the disease had not progressed into the latter stages. But progression of the disease could not be stopped or avoided. Nerve damage, skin lesions, and disfigurement were in his future. A person with leprosy was considered unclean, and they were socially isolated. So you can understand this dark cloud that had to hang over his head. He must have felt desperate and would be eager to find a cure for his disease. And the next scriptures give him a possibility of a cure and also show us how this young girl that was captive by Aram from Israel was used by God to offer the country now of Aram, an opportunity to know the true God of life. So we'll read verses 2 through 6 for that account. And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captives out of the land of Israel a little maid. And she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went in and told his Lord, saying, Thus and thus saith the maid that is of the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, Go, and I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 pieces of gold and 10 changes of raiment. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, Now when this letter is coming to thee, behold, I have therewith sent Naaman my servant to thee, and thou mayest recover him of his leprosy. As I mentioned earlier, Aram or Syria, during Ahab and Baasha's reigns, would invade Israel and bring out captives. And that nation, Aram, had a reputation for being a strong military nation, and they were strong economically, which was much unlike the struggling nations of Israel and Judah. And during one raid, they brought out this young captive girl who waited on Naaman's wife. Fortunately for Naaman, this young girl was old enough to know and have faith in God and to believe in God's prophet Elisha, who lived in Samaria, the capital of Israel. She spoke with her mistress about the possibility of her husband being healed by this prophet in Israel. Now, she must have been a brave young woman to approach her mistress with a solution to Naaman's issues. But the fact that Naaman was willing to follow through with the slave girl's suggestion indicated the severity of his situation. By doing nothing, the disease would eventually end his life. So he went to the king and reported what the slave girl had told his wife. The king's response was evident of how respected Naaman was. He gave Naaman his full support and offered to send a letter to Israel's king asking him to cure Naaman. Now remember, Israel and Aram were rarely on good terms with each other. So Naaman loads up hundreds of pounds of silver and gold and 10 sets of clothing. Now that was a tremendously generous offering that indicated Naaman was willing to give up a little of his pride and his prestige and his riches and his rank in order to be healed. He and his very large entourage traveled to the king of Israel and delivered the letter sent by Aram's king. The next scriptures take us to Israel's palace, and King Jehoram, or in some accounts it may read Joram, it's the same person. He was one of Ahab and Jezebel's sons. So we'll read verses 7 through 10. And it came to pass when the king of Israel had read the letter that he rent his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man doth send unto me to recover a man of his leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he seeketh a quarrel against me. And it was so, when Elisha, the man of God, had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, Wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and with his chariot, and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. Upon reading this letter, King Jehoram tore his clothes, a sign of deep distress done usually when there is a spiritual or a national crisis. Now, Jehoram probably was not feeling anything spiritual, for he was just as evil as his parents who ruled before him. And more likely, he wasn't even concerned about the nation of Israel, but he was worried probably more about his own life because he knew he had no power to cure Naaman. He thought that this must be some kind of trick or some way for the nation of Aram to pick a fight with Israel that Israel would surely lose. and he called in his officials to see why they thought a king would send a high-ranking official to him with such a request. Now, Elisha didn't get a text or an email, but somehow he learned of the king of Aram's request and of Jehoram tearing his clothes. Israel's king surely could not heal Naaman, but Elisha knew that God could. So he sent word for the king to send Naaman to him. He wanted both of these kings to realize that God still reigned in Israel. And I'm sure Jehoram was pleased to pass this situation on to someone else. So he gave Naaman Elisha's instructions. And with all of his horses and servants and chariots and extravagant gifts, Naaman showed up outside Elisha's house. Excuse me. He didn't get down from his chariot to knock on the door or ring the doorbell. He was the royalty here and was accustomed to being treated as such. So it was quite an insult when Elisha didn't even come out to greet him, and instead he sent out a messenger and told Naaman to go dip in the Jordan River 7 times and he would be cleaned of the disease. Now that was a pretty simple and easy to follow prescription for healing, not at all what Naaman expected. And we have the account of his reaction in the next scriptures, which will be verses 11 through 12. Excuse me. But Naaman was wroth and went away and said, Behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and strike his hand over the place and recover the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? May I not wash in them and be cleaned? So he turned and went away in a rage. Naaman was highly insulted by Elisha not coming out to greet him and by the demeaning instructions he sent. He just had to vent. Excuse me. The Abana and the Pharpar rivers flowed through Damascus, which was Syria's capital, and they were crystal clear. Dipping in any water of Israel would be a national insult to Aram, but to dip in the muddy waters of the Jordan is a small river. And it was also 25 miles away. Well, Naaman thought that was just outrageous. Why should he go there when he had perfectly beautiful water back home? Why couldn't he just dip and cleanse himself there? So he went away in a rage. His pride just could not allow him to believe such a simple act in muddy water was all it would take to rid him of his disease. Pride gets in our way sometimes too. When people are gifted and privileged, or when life is going smoothly, they find it hard to feel a need for Christ because they feel like they've got a handle on everything and they can do everything on their own. They live independently and they think they don't need a higher power to help them along. But on the other hand, people who live different lives, maybe struggling lives, know they need help and find it easier to turn to Jesus. Luckily, Naaman's servants were not afraid to speak up on his behalf, as we'll see in verses 13 and 14. And his servants came near and spake unto him and said, My father, if the prophet had bid thee to do some great thing, wouldest thou not have done it? How much rather then, when he saith to thee, Wash and be clean? Then he went down and dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. The servants made sure that Naaman understood they had major respect for him. That's why they called him father. And they began to appeal to his sense of logic. As a military commander, Naaman would have been quick to accept some difficult challenge for his healing, but something so simple as dipping 7 times in the Jordan River seemed so beneath his prominent position in society. It reminds us of how some people question the validity of the gospel because of its simplicity. They think, well, you mean all I have to do is believe and to put my faith in Jesus? Surely I must need to do something else, some big task. Being saved can't be just that simple. Well, Naaman's servants looked beyond the dirty river and saw the big picture. What did he have to lose? He couldn't buy his healing. All that gold and silver and those clothes that he brought with him didn't get the job done. His healing would only come to him as a result of his humble obedience. We aren't given the name of the slave girl who was behind Naaman going into Israel for help in the first place, and we don't know the names of these servants who reasoned with him. What we do know is that God uses unsung heroes, unnamed heroes, to accomplish his will. Naaman then parked by the river, stepped down from his chariot, and walked to the water's edge. He went deep enough to be able to dip himself 7 times in Jordan's water, and he stepped out with his skin cleared and restored. All it took was for him to humble himself and obey what God had spoken through his prophet. Naaman was a changed man. His skin was changed, but his heart was changed too. He led his entourage back to Elisha's house to declare that God is the one true God who alone is worthy of worship and praise. Now, if we can think back to times in our lives that God has turned trials into blessings for us, and I know you've heard it, or maybe you've even said yourself that something was a blessing in disguise, we can build on those experiences to face future challenges in our lives. We need to always be thanking God for his ever abiding presence, even in times when we can't see or know that he's there. And we need to ask for fresh ways to see him working in our everyday lives. I want to thank you for joining in today. I hope you'll have a great week, and hopefully the lessons will get caught up and we'll be on time from now on. If you have the time, I'd love for you to stay and listen to a song that touches on what we need to do to have our relationship with God. And if not, just have a good week, and hopefully you can join in again next time. Oops. I'm going to try that again. Well, that didn't work out so good, but the song was Trust and Obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Thank you for your time. Join again next time if you will. And if you can, join us in person at 9 o'clock on Sunday mornings, 10 o'clock for worship.